In May of 2003, a man named L. Paul Bremer stepped off a plane in Baghdad and within 2 weeks made two decisions that, more than any others, determined the shape of the next 20 years of Middle Eastern history. Bremer was the newly appointed head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, America's civilian administration of post-invasion Iraq. He had no prior experience in the Middle East. He spoke no Arabic. He had been in the country for roughly 10 days when he signed Coalition Provisional Authority Order No. 1, which dissolved the Ba'ath Party and removed every senior member from public employment. That was roughly 85,000 people, teachers, doctors, engineers, administrators fired overnight because they had joined the Ba'ath Party, which in Saddam's Iraq was often the only way to hold a professional job. 6 days later, he signed Order No. 2, which dissolved the entire Iraqi military. 400,000 trained soldiers, many of them armed, all of them now unemployed, all of them humiliated, with no severance and no prospects, turned out into a country with no functioning economy and no security apparatus to keep order. General J. Garner, the man Bremer replaced, had explicitly warned against disbanding the military. The State Department had warned against it. The CIA had warned against it. General Tommy Franks, who commanded the invasion, had assumed the Iraqi military would be kept intact and used for reconstruction and security. Nobody in uniform that I am aware of recommended what Bremer did. When Bremer was later asked who authorized Order No. 2, he said Rumsfeld approved it. Rumsfeld said he didn't recall seeing it. Condoleezza Rice said she didn't know it was coming. President Bush said he wasn't aware the Iraqi army was being dismissed. 400,000 soldiers put on the street, and nobody in the chain of command will claim the decision. Those men did not disappear. They organized. They were experienced. They were angry. And a significant number of them eventually ended up in a group that, within a decade, would seize a territory the size of the United Kingdom, hold 8 million people under its control, generate over $1 billion a year in revenue, and carry out or inspire attacks on every inhabited continent. That group was the Islamic State, and we built the conditions for it brick by brick. The organizational spine of ISIS was not formed in a mosque or a training camp. It was formed in an American prison. Camp Bucca was a U.S. detention facility in southern Iraq that at its peak held approximately 26,000 detainees. Between 2003 and its closure in 2009, it processed somewhere in the range of 100,000 Iraqi prisoners. The detention criteria in the early years were, to put it charitably, broad. Men were swept up in raids, held for months without charge, and placed in large open compounds where detainees could move freely and organize. What American commanders did not fully appreciate, and what former detainees have described in extensive detail, is that Camp Bucca became a graduate school for insurgency. Secular Ba'athist military officers, who would never have associated with Islamist radicals on the outside, were thrown into the same compounds with jihadist ideologues. The Ba'athists had the military expertise, logistics, operations planning, weapons handling, command structure. The jihadists had the ideology and the recruitment networks. Inside Bucca, they found each other, and they made each other more dangerous. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who would go on to declare himself Caliph of the Islamic State in 2014, was held at Camp Bucca. At least 9 of ISIS's top commanders were Camp Bucca alumni. Former detainees have described the camp as, in their words, the factory, the place where ISIS was manufactured. One senior ISIS commander told journalists he could not have built his network without it. By 2006, the insurgency in Iraq had metastasized into a full sectarian civil war. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the predecessor organization to ISIS, was carrying out mass casualty bombings targeting Shia civilians, deliberately trying to provoke retaliatory violence that would deepen the sectarian divide and make political reconciliation impossible. The strategy worked. Shia militias, some backed by Iran, responded with their own campaign of murder and displacement against Sunni communities. The Iraqi government, now dominated by Shia parties who had spent decades being persecuted by a Sunni-led Ba'athist regime, was in no mood for inclusion. Prime Minister Nuri al-Maliki, who took power in 2006 and who was effectively backed by the United States as the stable face of Iraqi democracy, systematically purged Sunni officers from the military, arrested Sunni political leaders on terrorism charges, and cut off funding to the Sunni awakening militias, the very groups that had turned against al-Qaeda and helped bring violence down during the surge. By 2013, Sunni communities in western Iraq felt more threatened by their own government than by the jihadists operating in their midst. When ISIS swept into Mosul in June 2014 with roughly 1,500 fighters, and the Iraqi army, 60,000 strong on paper, collapsed and ran, it was not primarily a military failure. It was a political failure that had been building for a decade. ISIS at its peak in 2014 and 2015 was unlike anything the world had seen from a non-state armed group. It held Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city. It held Raqqa in Syria. It controlled oil fields generating an estimated $1.5 million per day in revenue. It ran courts, schools, hospitals, and a tax collection system. It produced slick propaganda in dozens of languages and recruited fighters from over 100 countries. It carried out the Paris attacks in November 2015, killing 130 people, the Brussels bombings in 2016, the Manchester Arena bombing in 2017, inspired attacks from San Bernardino to Nice to Orlando. The military campaign to destroy ISIS, Operation Inherent Resolve, launched in August 2014, ultimately succeeded in its territorial objective. The physical caliphate was eliminated by March 2019. The campaign cost the United States approximately $14 billion, involved over 34,000 airstrikes across Iraq and Syria, and relied heavily on Kurdish forces, the YPG and the Peshmerga, who did the bulk of the ground fighting and took the bulk of the casualties. But here is what did not end in March 2019. ISIS did not end. The ideology did not end. The underlying conditions, Sunni political marginalization in Iraq, the Syrian civil war, ungoverned spaces across the Sahel and Central Asia, did not end. ISIS shifted from a territorial state to a dispersed insurgency, exactly as al-Qaeda had done before it, and as every defeated insurgency tends to do when you destroy its territory without resolving the grievances that generated it. As of 2024, the UN estimates ISIS retains between 5,000 and 7,000 fighters in Iraq and Syria alone, with active affiliates in West Africa, the Sinai, Afghanistan, and Southeast Asia. ISIS-K, the Afghan affiliate, carried out the Abbey Gate bombing at Kabul airport in August 2021, killing 13 American service members and 170 Afghan civilians during the evacuation. It carried out a mass casualty attack at the Crocus City Hall concert venue near Moscow in March 2024, killing over 140 people. We did not create the ideology. We did not create the sectarian tensions that ISIS exploited. We did not create the conditions that make men willing to die for a vision of a caliphate, but we dissolved an army of 400,000 men. We ran a prison that functioned as a networking hub for an insurgency. We backed a sectarian government that drove Sunnis into the arms of extremists. We created the power vacuum in which the Islamic State was born, recruited, organized, and from which it launched itself onto the world stage. The question is not whether we intended any of that. We obviously did not. The question is whether a nation that claims to lead the world has any obligation to understand the second and third-order consequences of what it does, whether intention is an adequate substitute for judgment. 400,000 soldiers on the street, one signature, that is how you build a caliphate.